The war is coming not with tanks, but with water tankers. In the streets of Donetsk, soldiers and civilians wait in the same line for water. The city's pro-Russian leader, Denis Pushilin, stated on August 25th that the solution was to seize the Siverskyi Donets Donbas Canal around Sloviansk.
У нас в Донецко-Макеевской агломерации сейчас раз в 3 дня на несколько часов подается вода, а в Янакиево и группе городов близлежащих раз в 4 дня, в Мариуполе раз в 2 дня.
In other words, the administration, unable to provide water, is trying to cover up the crisis by expanding its territory. However, it cannot even find enough water for its soldiers. This was actually an official declaration of the helplessness of the occupying Russian administration. Now, the burden of daily life also screams that this crisis is too deep to be covered up. The Russian administration is helpless in the face of the water crisis, which has caused people in the region to queue up in long lines in front of water trucks. While the water supply in suburban settlements, such as Yanakieva, has fallen to once every 4 days, in the city center of Donetsk, water that used to come every 2 days is now only provided every 3 days, as the new normal. Moreover, the water provided is unreliable in terms of both quantity and quality. Aeration schedules usually only include 4 hours of distribution every 3 days. That is, between 5 and 9 p.m. In some apartment buildings, low water pressure means that water may not even reach the second floor, making the possibility of the tap not working at home a part of daily life. Under these conditions, people carry water in 30 to 40-liter containers. Embrace is like a test when it comes to sea. Step is like a test where fatigue shifts from the physical to the emotional. A 78-year-old woman's outcry, "How can I carry this load?" reveals a clash that statistics cannot express.
I am 78 years old. Young people are collecting water. How am I supposed to come here, collect water, and bring it back home?
In some neighborhoods, the situation is completely paralyzed. There are households that say they haven't had a single drop of water for 12 days. In the city, thirst is no longer a crisis, but a permanent way of life. Although the Russian local government has imposed a price cap on bottled water to control public panic, the long queues are getting a little longer every day. As of tankers and aid equipment sent from Moscow are not a solution. On the contrary, they have become scenes that reveal the magnitude of the crisis. Ordinary daily needs such as cleaning, food preparation, and personal hygiene are now carried out like separate operations planned by the hour. However, the greatest risk is emerging in public institutions. With the depletion of water reservoirs, hospitals are disrupting their sterilization routines. The situation on the health front is worsening, and the risk map is expanding. Prolonged interruptions accelerate the growth of amoebas and bacteria in stagnant water bodies. The disruption of cleaning and hand hygiene increases the risk of epidemics. Diseases such as intestinal infections are spreading among the local population and the Russian army. This situation is making hospitals increasingly dependent on serum and electrolyte supplements, aquacactics. However, these materials are also limited, transported via the logistics chain, and delays trigger a chain reaction of health crises. The accumulation of garbage and household waste threatens urban health on multiple fronts. Irregularly collected garbage increases rodent and insect populations. Collaborated not only physical illness, but also psychological pressure and environmental degradation. Bakeries and kitchens that produce food for the masses are forced to operate with limited water and poor hygiene conditions. Food safety is weakening. The risk of poisoning is increasing. The political repercussions of the disruptions experienced by society were not long in coming. Letters written to Putin, shared videos, and threatening warnings of price controls increased expectations that the administration would provide services rather than impose pressure. While people wait in tanker queues, the impact of propaganda broadcasts remains limited, and messages that do not address the agenda are met with backlash. "We are bringing water" news is measured by the color and smell of the water that comes out when the tap is turned on. The administration's explanation of short-term malfunctions loses its persuasive power when considered alongside 2 weeks of no pressure. Field workers are constantly monitored, and these inspections focus as much on finding scapegoats as on technical fault. Cold water is another source of tension. As metallurgical and chemical plants continue production, they consume water, reducing the share allocated for household consumption. Restarted local news reports highlight complaints that while some facilities continue to have access to water, interruptions in households are prolonged. This fuels the debate over priority justice and amplifies public reaction. Meanwhile, the water crisis is now shaping not only civilian life, but also Russian military operational planning directly. The conflict zone in Donetsk suddenly becomes not just a battlefield, but also a scene where soldiers search for wells. For frontline troops, every day means fighting not only the enemy, but also thirst. Striving now have to defend not only their positions, but also the containers they carry water in. While battalion patrol routes were previously determined by reconnaissance or security priorities, these calculations are now being rewritten based on distance to resupply points. Long-distance patrols are being replaced by short-range sentry duties with access to water. Mobile units are moving with more frequent rest intervals to prevent neurological or muscular fatigue caused by fluid depletion. This reduces operational continuity. Physical tasks such as fortification and trench construction, which used to take hours of work, are now limited to a maximum of 1 to 2 hours. Digging and carrying tasks that place excessive strain on the body are measured according to the soldier's water reserves. Yet while trying to build positions, there are questions about whether the effort expended in every movement is worth it. Abbas armored vehicles are not immune to this crisis either. In particular, motor cooling, fire prevention systems, and liquid requirements for cleaning purposes are now being relegated to non-priority items in the logistics chain. Maintenance plans for tanks and armored personnel carriers are being revised. Detailed maintenance is being carried out in base areas where water is abundant, while locations closer to the front lines have to make do with only critical interventions. Embarked of the human factor, the effects of dehydration are becoming visible. Fluid loss slows down not only physical performance, but also cognitive functions. Although there are reports from the field that some soldiers are close to the brink of rebellion due to the water crisis, crossing that threshold depends on various factors. Command and control, criminal sanctions and financial incentives create a barrier that makes it difficult for personnel to switch sides. However, symbolic defections are not impossible, especially during long rationing periods. Symbolic cases are highly valuable for propaganda and counter-propaganda. Liabilities, whether these scenarios become a lasting trend, must be evaluated not only in terms of water, but also in terms of pay, leave, health, and logistics. Water is the most visible and urgent of these variables. To understand this water crisis, we need to look not only at the landscape of drought, but also at the history of the infrastructure that shaped that landscape. Because today's leaky taps actually tell the story of a pipeline laid 70 years ago that has reached the end of its life. During the Soviet era, the Siverskyi Donets Donbas Canal, implemented in the mid-1950s, was built to bring water to the Donetsk region. This pipeline, approximately 133 to 135 kilometers long, carried water from the Siverskyi Donets River to the Kalmius Basin, preventing industrial centers, mining towns, and growing settlements from running dry. In other words, Donbass's current industrial memory grew out of this canal. Over the decades, the system not only aged but also suffered irreversible damage due to neglect, infrastructure fatigue, and war. Pump stations, filtration centers, intermediate reservoirs, and distribution lines reached the end of their technical lifespan and were repeatedly targeted during the conflicts that began in 2014. Became not just a necessity, but a subject of conflict. The full-scale invasion that began in 2022, the pipeline completely turned into a war front. The areas through which the pipes run along the pipeline are now at risk of bombardment. This situation has made it nearly impossible for maintenance crews to work. Power lines, signaling systems, and access roads have either been completely cut off or are barely functioning with temporary repairs. Reservoirs feeding the canal have begun to succumb to nature's own cycle. Drought, flooding, and unseasonal water levels have completely destabilized the structure's already limited capacity. Each new climatic fluctuation exposes another weak point in the system. And finally, rationing plans, once prepared only for emergencies, have now become part of the daily routine. So what can Russia do in this situation? The Kremlin has options it can put on the table to counter the growing water crisis in Donetsk. However, all of these options are either excessively costly, extremely risky, or unsustainable in terms of time. Theoretically, the first option is to carry out a military advance towards Sloviansk to regain control of the Siverskyi Donets Donbas Canal. This area is crucial in terms of the canal's water intake points and regulation structures. However, achieving this objective on the ground would only be possible through a large-scale offensive. This would require thousands of soldiers, hundreds of vehicles, and an operation that could last for months. On the Ukrainian front, where field conditions are becoming more complex by the day, implementing such a strategy would entail significant resource consumption and a high risk of casualties. Moreover, even if control is gained, simply capturing positions is not enough to make this line operational. The canal line runs right through the middle of the conflict zones, presenting an extremely complex environment from an engineering perspective. Unexploded ordnance, destroyed culverts, damaged pumping stations, and interrupted power lines make it impossible for technical teams to work safely. The infrastructure needed to supply power to the area is also under intense threat of attack. Under these conditions, it is unrealistic to even carry out basic maintenance work, let alone repair the canal. Moreover, since the reservoirs and stations supplying the water are still under Ukrainian control, any technically feasible intervention would also constitute a direct interference with the sovereignty of the other side. This triggers not only risks on the ground but also international diplomatic consequences. Kiev is unlikely to approve such a water transfer. Thus, a solution that appears physically possible becomes impossible on the diplomatic level. For all these reasons, the regional administration in Donetsk's proposal to liberate Sloviansk as a solution actually means shifting responsibility to the rear instead of providing services. Delegating this task, which is the primary responsibility of a municipality or civil administration, to a military operation reads like an admission of an inability to govern effectively. The second option could be to transport water from the Don River to the region and establish temporary or secondary systems to purify the raw water. Although this method appears to be a safer alternative due to critical points such as Sloviansk being in the conflict zone, it is not easy to implement. This solution requires hundreds of kilometers of pipeline, mobile purification systems, generators, water tankers, and constant protection. The cost of installing the facilities and the operational burden are already high, and the instability of the energy supply in the region makes this effort even more fragile. Nevertheless, it has the potential to produce more concrete results in the short term compared to uncertain frontline targets. The third path is to focus on preventing leaks, spills, and losses in the existing distribution network. The official statement that the water network in Donetsk suffers losses of up to 60% highlights the importance of this area. However, efforts to prevent leakage in pipelines that have been damaged in the war, neglected, and reached the end of their technical life are slow in terms of both engineering and time. Such rehabilitation means a reconstruction process spread over years and cannot provide a short-term solution to the acute dimensions of the crisis. The fourth strategy is to centrally and strictly control water distribution, particularly by controlling tanker shipments and organizing distribution to the public through military/civilian security forces. However, this method will inevitably increase anger among the public, who are already exhausted from waiting for water. Placing such a vital need as water under military control further undermines confidence in the weak administration. Furthermore, this practice carries the risk of directing water to connected parties rather than those who truly need it. This in turn heightens both social tension and allegations of corruption. The fifth and most controversial route is an international humanitarian aid appeal. Water, filters, generators, or mobile facility assistance could be provided through the Red Cross, UN agencies, or civil organizations with access to the region. While this approach is rationally justified from a humanitarian perspective, politically it would mean a heavy loss of prestige for the Kremlin. The image of Russia, unable to provide public services in the annexed territories, could backfire, especially among the domestic public. Furthermore, the entry of external actors into the region could be met with resistance within the security apparatus, as it would complicate the control of information and image flow. The administration is therefore shifting its rhetoric towards seizing territory and placing the technical burden on the military. However, water is managed with valves and pumps, not rocket batteries. Any plan that ignores this reality will fail the test in the next tanker queue. There is a 60 to 90-day window for repairs and interim solutions before winter approaches. During this window, a plan should be prepared for leak reduction, mobile purification units, and priority distribution for critical services. Otherwise, freezing conditions, frozen infrastructure, and ice-covered roads will exacerbate the crisis. Tanker logistics become more expensive and dangerous in winter. Home storage behavior increases and water quality deteriorates further. The risk of infection and hospital visits increases, and the healthcare system becomes overly dependent on hygiene materials instead of water. Fire safety weakens, and small fires can turn into major disasters. Schools close frequently, and the remote education infrastructure struggles with energy problems. In this scenario, the citizens' only expectation from the state is a reliable tap. When the tap is not turned on, no political message can fill the void. Let's frame a brief conclusion instead of a result. The water problem in Donetsk is no longer just an infrastructure failure. It has become an intersection of governance capacity, security planning, and public trust. You cannot turn on the tap by saying, "I'll take the channel." Without electricity, security, pumps, and personnel, the pipe is just a pipe. Increasing the number of tankers is not a permanent solution either. Logistical limitations, costs, and security risks quickly hit a wall. While people wait for hours for a jug of water, pressure gauges speak louder than propaganda texts. As long as pressure does not reach a sustainable level, the politics of scarcity will remain on the agenda. Therefore, technical repairs, distributed solutions, and transparent rationing plans must be implemented together. Otherwise, the 60 to 90-day window before winter will close, and the crisis will intensify. The closing window also signals that the next summer will be worse. When unmanaged, the water crisis shuts off not only the tap, but also legitimacy. Thank you for watching.